always been when you think about African American history, for example, right? You can't discuss it without it being in the same kind of vein as American history, right? And so there's a number of things that I personally, as a descendant, as a love of history, have gone through in my lifetime that allows me to kind of speak very, I would say, fluently on this topic. Um, I am from Charlottesville, Virginia. I was born in 1974. So right after the civil rights movement, so to speak, quote unquote. And there's this term that I use called generation of transition, which means that, I was one of the first to actually go to school in an integrated setting. I've met childhood friends if you're from Charlottesville, I went to Greenbrier Elementary School. Before that, I was at Mary C. Greer School, right beside Jack Jewett Middle School, right behind Albemarle High School. Um, and so my journey as an African American man is one that's had its highs and lows, but very consistent with, I think, the experiences of many African American men. And so when I think about, these kind of life lessons in this journey in particular, um, I think that there's some things that we can see that would actually help us chart to a deeper and greater future in terms of the whole concept of community. Okay. So as I mentioned, I am a resident I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, but my family's from Albemarle County, Virginia. So for you history buffs, that is a little small town called Blenheim. We used to call it Monroe Town back in the day. And it's about 6 miles from Highland, the home of President James Monroe, the presidential site. So I'm gonna let you take a minute to recognize my last name, Monroe, and then also bring up James Monroe. Are there any interesting things there that you want to call out, considering our family place, our home place is 6 miles from Highland Plantation? Any thoughts there? This is an open conversation, by the way. Last name is Monroe. The president's name is Monroe. What are your thoughts?
Hey, George, I'm guessing there's a crossover there,
I would
in
say it's
terms of,
more than a cross. Like we have this term, this colloquialism in the African American community that says Dana doesn't lie.
yeah.
So Dana refers to DNA. Okay. And so when we think about, for example, oral family histories and things of that nature, um, you know, a lot of times family members will say certain things and they will reference certain things. And then if you have an ear and you're listening to what's being said, you can actually piece together stories. Okay. And I was one of those curious kids where I would oftentimes sit underneath the windowsill, if that makes sense. Or I was sitting by the door molding and kind of listen to what was being said in the other room. Okay. Because a lot of times, the family members back then, the ancestors, the elderly, they didn't talk about a lot of things. Okay. And so I want to give you an idea as far as what I'm talking about. Okay. So, like I had mentioned, I was born in 1974. My father was born in 1953. My grandfather Bill was born in, I believe, 1935. His father was born in 1891. And then my great grandfather George, his father was born in 1828, who was the person that was enslaved at Highland. Okay, so think about that in terms of the proximity of time, right? Where you're looking at a scenario of me being raised for a certain period of my life. I was raised by my great grandmother, okay, who was 99 years old when she passed away in 2000. She was married to the son of the person that was enslaved at Highland, right? So when you think about the whole concept of, the proximity of time as it relates to being able to get to what we refer to in history as primary and secondary sources, okay, I had an ear to a secondary source that was able to tell me stories about the makeup of this man and his father, who was an enslaved person. And so now, fast forward to 2025. I'm 50 years old this year, be 51 in April. Okay. Now think about the fact of me being able to reach back through time to basically hear and understand specifically certain things that took place that the average person who doesn't have that close proximity of time will be able to embrace and be able to accept as part of their life makeup. And so I was privileged to be born into a family of longevity where folks just tend to live a long time. And prayerfully, that's my experience where, my great grandmother lived to be 99 years old. Okay. And she was able to tell me stories about who my family was and who we came from. Um, and so when I think about the president, James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States, our family history goes that he had a relationship with Thenia Hemmings. And anybody ever heard of the Hemmings family? Okay, so the Hemmings family, Thenia was the older sister, Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings is the one that we know that was at Monticello with Jefferson, and then of course you know the whole story there. But Thenia is not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of information about. And so, through the presence of oral history and some luck in finding some documentation, we started the piece part of her life where she had, I think, upwards of five children. And at some point near at the end of her life, she was moved to Highland and was there with her children. Okay. And then when you read certain correspondences, as they reflect on who she was, when she passed away, it said that President Monroe was very distraught at her passing. Okay. So this is what we see documentation wise. But then when we look at, for example, um, the stories of the family, I was able to get my hands on oral history information related to the, the experience of the Monroe family down in Albemarle County. And they said that, she was pretty much the matriarch of the family along with Monroe. And so when we look at this oral history that was documented as of 1860, right? They're talking about relationship to James Monroe as far as, the family being linked to him, but not really being accepting of it because who would want to? Because he was not only a president, but he was an overseer. He ran a plantation, and so people were held against their bondage. I mean, excuse me, they were held in bondage against their will. And so, as I mentioned previously, there was a lot of things that the old folks wouldn't talk about. They didn't want to, kind of delve into those different things because they had full knowledge of as to who they were. Um, but then there was also what I would say, kind of growing up on that farm, there was a quiet trauma. Okay. So many times when you think about enslavement, you talk about, okay, yeah, folks were held in bondage, but not a lot of times do you hear anything related to what I would say the treatment, the physical treatment, the emotional treatment, and the mental treatment of folks, and the generational impact and legacies that these events have had on them. That's the ugly side of enslavement. Not that there's a pretty side of enslavement, but there's the ugly repercussions that folks don't actually want to talk about as it relates to me sitting here in 2025, admitting as an African American man that, you know what, I have issues that I can readily identify. And then if I trace their origin point, it goes back and it's rooted into the experience of slavery. That's the lesser known discussions that take place. In fact, and when you think about kind of, you know, issues with relationships, issues with, emotive ability, my wife and I, we had a conversation. We have five kids together, and one of my kids is a bonus son that she had from a previous marriage. And when you think about, for example, how we discipline our kids, right? And I have, no reserve in saying this, in that when she noticed the way I would discipline the older son, she would come to me because she's Filipino, and she would say, "Well, why were you so harsh?" But all I was thinking was, well, this is something that I learned. That This is how I was treated when I was growing up in terms of forms of punishment, whether corporal or otherwise. And then come talking to my parents and then going back and forth, a lot of the ways that we discipline our kids, even as African Americans, have their ways rooted in slavery in terms of corporal punishment, right? Um, it could be that, like, and even in some of the terminology, for example, you talk about things like, hey, you're gonna get a beating or you're gonna get a whooping, right? Versus, hey, you're in timeout or you're grounded, right? Even the terms beating and whipping they feel very violent in nature. But that was the reality of the generations post-slavery because that's what they saw, that's what they learned. Okay. And it was interesting for me growing up that I was raised with my great grandparents and you would think about, for example, how we would get up 4:30 in the morning. We would go out and we would tend the fields, right? There was no running water in the house. There was no plumbing. So there was an outhouse that you had to use. And so at Montpelier site, there is a Gilmore cabin right across on Route 20, and it's what they refer to as a freedman cabin, one of the last remaining documented freedman cabins that they have in the United States. Well, one of the other ones is right on the family home place, the Monroe family home place that my great great grandfather and his wife built. There's still a freedman's cabin there that still is resided in by my family members, my extended family members. And so you're talking about a property that was built in 1881. Okay. The house is still there. And so, as I was mentioning, as I lived there and as I grew up, I learned a lot of lessons that pretty much what I refer to as advancing the time or bringing me back in time, because a lot of the methods and a lot of the things that we went through growing up couldn't find their traces in slavery just because of the folks that were there running and their life experience. Okay. So we lived on the farm till I was about probably 9, no, well, 11, 12 years old. And then we would go back and forth in terms of visiting and helping out, in the fields. And of course, when it's time to like, harvest pigs and things like that, that was a big homecoming event where all the family members that were here and that were there spread throughout, they would come home and then we would actually have that event. And that was an opportunity to get caught up. And so I learned very early on that there was something unique about my family. And that there was, when you look in the eyes of the men in my family, there's a certain fire that exists, right? There's a certain no nonsense attitude, very direct, very strong, very stubborn individuals, I would even say. And as I started this journey of trying to uncover who I am, I learned that, there was documented resistance even during enslavement of family members, right? So there's one story of my grandfather Ned's sons, both Garland and Henry, and they were going to something called a prayer meeting. Okay, back during the enslavement period, the enslaved would actually gather in the woods and actually have their own prayer meetings. That was different in substance and topic from that of the master or the overseer, right? So even in today's time, there's questions about, okay, is Christianity the white man's religion or are you studying true Christianity? Is Christianity based on Christian or white nationalism, or is it true Christianity? So even then, if you read the slave narratives, and if you read, some of the White House had a writers project back in the 30s where the enslaved gave their stories, and you can see that there is a clear distinction between what they believed to be the gospel versus what they were being told in terms of things like slaves obey your masters. That was used to subjugate, and it was used to reinforce the narrative that you were supposed to be in bondage. But during this particular time, they had this concept called the paddle roller, who was responsible for going up and breaking up these types of meetings that were done in secret, from the standpoint of making sure that these weren't meetings to actually plan insurrections, okay, which was a very big thing in Virginia. If you think about, for example, Gabriel Presser and Nat Turner, these were proponents of, what I refer to as self-emancipation, when you kind of say, you know what, I'm not going to wait for any sort of changes in law. I'm going to will myself to freedom. And so Henry was actually working at Monticello. At the time this slave meeting was taking place, and they had a stump preacher called Tucker Coles, where the enslaved preacher or the speaker for that moment would get on an old stump, and he would actually talk about a particular passage in the Bible, and what they would do they would hang up different noisemakers or tin pans and things like that throughout the trees, so that way if somebody was trying to sneak up on them, what would happen is the noise would actually give them an early warning symbol and signal for them to basically break it up and get back to camp. Okay, and so in this particular instance, Henry and his brother, uh, Rice, I believe it was, they were chased. And so if you know anything about Route 20 in Charlottesville, going towards Carter's Bridge, well, that river right beside Route 20 is the Hardware River. Okay, and so the story goes that um, by the time they gave chase to paddle rollers, were quickly gaining speed and almost catching up with them. And so they got by the river, and there was a log across the river to help to facilitate being able to cross. They hid in the bushes, and then the paddle rollers got halfway through the log, and then they jumped in and then basically tossed that log over into the water and pushed the paddle rollers into the water and got back to camp before they even were found out. Okay, there's other stories about how they would resist and things of that nature that were well documented. And so when I was doing this research, I learned about a lot about who I am and what makes me tick and how I take a look at my attitude. I take a look at my son's attitudes, and I'm like, that might be why we're so stubborn sometimes. That might be why we're so determined. So, and I don't know where that exactly came from, but I am able to go back to the historical record and see stories about my great great grandfather Ned, who I believe is the grandson of James Monroe, having been born in 1828. And it talks about how he was a fair dealing, strong, and honest man. In fact, at the UVA DEC Memorial on UVA's campus. His name is there. His father's name is Bristow. He's there. My grandmother Harriet is there. And they're all listed within the memorial. And so when you think about oral history, you think about some of the things that you read in the history books and historical documentation, you're able to take all these different pieces and bring them together. Okay. And so that helps you to get pretty much a basis. The census record, even, it helps you get a basis as far as, you know, who is who. Um, these are the people that they talked to you about when you were growing up. These are the pictures that actually hung on the wall. These are their names. And then also you get an opportunity to actually see what their personality was like. Oral history also allows you to see, mannerisms and, physical features if you don't have photos and whatnot. And so I'm blessed because of the fact that I was able to live in the old home place for a period of time. I'm blessed because, there were photos. I forget the name of the type of photo in the late 19th to 20th, early 20th century, but there's a number of photos of the early family members. And so in doing the research, Ned had I think he had 18 children. Um, well, all with the last name Monroe, and he was married 3 times. And so um, it's funny because when I first started the journey and trying to document the history, I would go to my great aunts and uncles, and they were like, "Well, we don't know who some of these people are. We never met them." And that's because Ned's span for having children was from 1851, his oldest son, to 1891, his youngest son. So imagine that, you're in your 60s having children, running a farm, right? So I can only pray to be that strong when that occurs. And so at the end of the day, you have this kind of legacy of, the family land, the oral history, the documentation even that allows us to kind of paint a picture as to who we are, the emotional makeup even, the good and the bad, right? And so there were a lot of things, and I had mentioned this about, some conversations that my wife and I had, and it was like, like things that you want to celebrate in terms of what's good about your family lineage and legacy. And then there's also some things that you want to get away from, right? And so that's a very sensitive topic within the African American community because, you know, There are some things that happen emotionally and physically, like I mentioned before, that get passed down from generation to generation. Okay. And so, unless we identify its source, it's difficult for us to then be able to say, okay, how do we actually, um, get in a scenario where we can actually start to correct some of those things instead of promoting the continuation of these hard things that actually impacted our family. And so that's where it kind of came to a head for me. You know, one of the things that I recognize in my own life is that I had issues with relationships, right? I had issues with being angry. I had issues with um, having a hair trigger response. And some people might even call it rage. Okay. And then when I was going on this journey for self-discovery, I was at the University of Richmond working on my master's program, and we had to do this tool called the genogram, right? The genogram is something that allows you to basically document your family tree. And then there's certain symbols that you can actually start to plot that will help you with being able to say, okay, here's some different trends that are taking place within my family line that also impact me. And so some of the things that we identified when I looked specifically at the Monroe family line was there were issues with, like I said, failed relationships. I saw a pattern of divorce, right? I saw patterns of addiction. I saw patterns of violence, right? Um, I saw patterns of certain sicknesses, illnesses, right? Diabetes, hypertension, strokes, things of that nature. And so it was like when I was able to document all of that, I was able to see that, you know what, there's based upon uncles, aunts, cousins, my direct line, there are certain themes and trends that I want to basically try to solve for my own family. So a lot of times individuals will go and trace their family history just because they want to know. I basically traced my family history because I wanted to figure me out, right? There was another thing with our family where the men were womanizers, which led to a lot of infidelity and a lot of kids out of wedlock. And so and I started seeing myself in my early as a younger man going in that path. And so like when I got to a point of self-realization, the question then became, now, how do I stop these things from happening? Right. And it's not enough to kind of be like, okay, well, um, I'm just gonna make a decision to stop. But sometimes you have to go trace and get to the root of a matter. And then, I don't know what your faith is, but my faith says that I need to basically confess it and say and renounce it and say that I don't want this for the following generations after me. And so it took a lot of kind of understanding who we are as people, the good and the bad, understanding where a lot of these things got their source from, and then it would actually help me with, being focused on developing who I am, all right, as a person and as a human being, right? And so the question was, is there a relationship for me in terms of President James Madison? There is no direct relationship, but I am the executive director for the Montpelier Descendants Committee. So that's the relationship to me in Montpelier and um, the topic for Black History this month. So yeah, so when I started kind of going down this path, right, and I established this genealogy thing, the genogram, then it was able to also speak directly to me about, where certain things um, I should have to focus on to basically do some level of self-improvement because I didn't want the legacy of slavery, even though I might not have been in physical bondage at this point, I no longer wanted to be any sort of emotional bondage. Okay. And I think a lot of African Americans are starting to, research family members and themselves in their history to get to a point to where it's like, you know, um, I want to basically address some of these things so that way we can make sure that we are whole moving forward. And like I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of the topics of consideration or discussion on what are the legacies or the impact of enslavement on your emotional and mental health, right? And so fortunately, I was able to actually cross this road, in the late 90s after having some run-ins legally and whatnot. And so and then it was going through a counselor and actually having to do this work that I actually started to get to a point where I can, really start to address these things. But then it didn't start there, because then after we had an opportunity to kind of get George together, then it became about, okay, so how do I learn more about what makes me up? Because in our oral family history, we said that we were connected to James Monroe. So the next thing I did is I got a DNA test. All right. Ancestry.com. Right. I submitted my sample, and my mouth dropped when I got the results back. Okay. Hey, George, you're 17% European. You're 3%, 17% English. You're 3% Norwegian. You're 3% Irish. You're 3% German, right? And I even had 1% Southeast Asia. Okay. So when you think about, okay, the oral family history, the historical documentation, then you tie it back into the actual DNA results. Now we're talking about science. Now it gets interesting, right? Because now you want to learn a little bit more about who you are as an individual. You want to learn more about those different cultures that supposedly make you up. And so when I go up to a blue-eyed, blonde-haired person, and I say, "Hey, guess what? I'm 27% European, but you can never tell it by looking at me," right? And then when I was looking at some of the pictures of my family, I'm like, okay, well, going back generation to generation to generation, you can see those features coming through loud and clear, right? And so I have this thing where I say, like, if it looks like a duck and it smells like a duck, it's a what? It's a duck, right? And so getting involved with the University of Virginia to research this information, getting involved with James Monroe's Highland. And then, of course, having a chance meeting with an historian by the name of Sam Towler. He's located here in Charlottesville. We were up in the courthouse, and we were looking at deeds to the property. As I mentioned, our home place was purchased by my grandfather in 1881 through a lease agreement. I guess we would call that lease to own now, right? Where he was able to pay it off over 3 years in 1884. He received the property outright. And so, chance encounter, I was looking up the deed information, and my father going back and forth, like, where would he get this land from, being 19 years post-slavery, right? Can't read or write. How do you even make that happen? And there's this old white guy sitting in the corner, and he's like, "Hey, what'd you say your last name was?" I said Monroe. He said, "Well, um, I bet you 9 times out of 10 that you all came off of that Monticello Randolph plantation, and that's where your linkage is." So in that brief conversation, he gave me 100 years worth of history that I hadn't known before. So then there was some element of luck that actually took place. And so kind of building off of that, you know, everything started to make sense then in terms of what my life purpose was supposed to be, what I was going to go after next. And that was to basically become a citizen with a worldview. Okay. My goal was to go visit all of these different places that made up my genetic makeup. So imagine me hanging out in Norway, eating a reindeer hot dog. Little curly head kid from Albemarle County. I'm in Norway and I'm hanging out, you know, and I'm trying to learn the local customs. I've been to Africa, I've been to Ghana, I've been to Nigeria, I've been to Kenya, I've been to Ethiopia. And I was able to then go and start this kind of quest for understanding and trying to figure out who I am, what makes me tick as a man. And so I realized that, our issues are not just linked to, you know, kind of like within that kind of one state radius that we feel like we come from. But when you have an opportunity to go across the world and you go to different countries, you actually start to notice certain things. You notice that poverty smells the same. You notice that there's no such thing as diversity. And that once you start to dig past the layers that we all present, we start to realize that, you know what, we are all more alike than we are different. That goes for white, black, Asian. I even hung out in China, believe it or not, and the Philippines. Okay. And so you start to realize that the world is a lot smaller when you open yourself up to have these types of targeted conversations to where you can meet first as people and being able to um, utilize those shared experiences to bridge a common bond. Okay. And so, with that said, and kind of having this kind of newfound knowledge of who I am as a person, now it's about us being able to, us as individuals, partner with each other to think about how do we move forward together in community, right? So one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet was that during this time of self-discovery, I had something called a crisis of faith. Anybody ever been there? Where you start questioning, like, okay, well, God, why does all of this stuff happen? Why does this happen? And how come we can't get along and this and that? And so it was interesting for me because I was always a fan of history, but it was actually in the 90s when you think about, for example, religion, you know, there was this concept called the conscious movement. All right. A lot of folks would call it being woke these days. Okay. But it was through hip hop music that I learned about the different religions that actually exist in the world today that specifically spoke to African Americans or Africans in general kind of being, part and parcel to, advancing civilizations, right? So when I talked about, going overseas and going to different places like in Africa and Ethiopia, well, a lot of that was about, okay, so how do I unlearn what I felt like was a religion based upon white supremacy? You know, how do I take a look at these slave narratives that I talked about before, where they talking about experiencing different forms of religion in Africa and then bringing them over to the New World in bondage, and then knowing the difference between what they were taught, at the overseer and the plantation, and then of course what they knew to be true from their time in Africa. So then that's when I experienced that crisis of faith because at that point I started questioning everything that was in front of me, or at least that had been taught to me from a religion standpoint. And so um, I learned about the Coptic Christians in Ethiopia, right? I learned about um, how Egypt, for example, had 7 mystery schools that a lot of European philosophers came and got a lot of their basis of information from, right? We know it as Western civilization, but kind of coincidentally, the Western civilization piece excludes the African influence, right? And so I also learned that, Christianity flourished in Africa 500 to 600 years before it even hit European soil. And that the early church fathers, if you do your research, were African. People like Cyprian, Tertullian, St. Augustine. These were all African theologians that lived in North Africa that were responsible for sharing this information, and it flourishing down the west coast of Africa. And that's how the enslaved actually got their information about who Christ was. And then, of course, you can't neglect Islam and the different variations of Islam in that too before they even got to the U.S. And so think about this, and I'm going to bring this all to a tight bow. Think about how, you know, here I am. I'm growing up on this farm, right? I do know some aspects of my family history because of photos on the wall. I do know that there's some bad behaviors and some good behaviors that are part and parcel to my family that make me up. But then through the advent of science, through the advent of research, I'm now informing my worldview and it's showing me my life is bigger than what was initially kind of presented for me, right? And now I'm able to say, you know what? Now I can look at this particular type of topic and I can grow from it. And now I can use this kind of self-awareness and lead it in the standpoint of when I have different interactions with individuals, I'm able to walk in love with them and I'm able to show like, because I am a citizen of the world and I'm not confined by a specific viewpoint, I'm actually able to engage in a conversation to get us to a point where we can now start to come together as community, right? And so tying it back to where we kind of began, oral history taught me that, like learning where I first started from. Different research and methods and tools taught me that. Okay. And then actually being living in the world as an African American man, the good and the bad, right? Experiencing different bouts of racism and things like that. You know, I was always curious in that I wanted to understand what was the source of that and where did it come from. Okay, so now I'm able to look at these different things objectively and then kind of say, okay, well, um, what do I do about this? Right. So, I've told this story once before about, I guess, right before the first Trump election, I was at a gas station locally here in Hanover County. And there's this guy that pops up. He's got, you know, a car full of bumper stickers, Confederate flag bumper stickers. He gets out and he gets out of his car. He's got a Confederate flag hat on. He's got a T-shirt that says "Good old boy," Confederate flag. And so sometimes, and for some of my friends that know me, sometimes I can be really petty, right? So you know what was coming. So he's standing right next to me, and it's an opportunity to have a conversation. And so I'm like, "Hey," and he just kind of gives me this strange look. It's like he's surprised that I spoke to him. I'm like, "What's going on, bro?" Right? And this guy was like, "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I don't want any trouble." I'm like, "I'm not here to give you any trouble. I'm just saying hello." Right? He says, "Well, hi." Guy's name was Chuck. Okay. And so I said, "Chuck," I said, I said, "Do you live in the area?" He said, "No, I'm from Louisa." So Louisa, from where I live, is probably 10 miles, 15 miles from where I live at. I said, "Okay, my family's from Louisa." I said, you know, "Can you tell me something about why do you have all of those flags and stuff on your car? Like, what are you trying to, like, what is it that you're trying to communicate?" You know, he said, "Man, I don't want any problems. I don't want any trouble." I'm like, "I'm not trying to give you any trouble. I just want to know, like, what makes you tick, man? Like, why do you feel like you need to put that out there?" And he was like, "Well, you know, I love the South because my grandfather loved the South." I said, "Well, what about the South do you love?" He said, "Man, it's my heritage, it's my history, and it's where I'm from." I said, "Okay." So bona fide Confederate, obviously, because you're representing it. I said, so tell you what, man. I said, my family's from the South. In fact, my family's from the same county that you're from. Does that also make me a Confederate? And this guy just looked at me with the strangest look on his face because he didn't know how to respond, right? And I was like, "I'm not trying to set you up. I want to understand specifically your viewpoint because by your definition, you love history. It's your heritage, right? You said your grandfather was a heavy influence on you, and he's from this area, and you both love the South." I said, "I'm from the South. I'm from Virginia. My family's from Louisa County. They were raised up here too. So by your definition, am I a Confederate as well? Or should I be?" And he didn't know how to answer that. So then I took it a step further, and I said, "Tell me about that flag you have on, and tell me about Robert E. Lee, right? Because I'm interested in him." And by this time, obviously our tanks were full, but we're just sitting there shooting the breeze now. And he's like, "Look, man, I don't really know a whole lot about Robert E. Lee. I just know that my grandfather, what I'm saying, loved the South. And, therefore I love the South because I have a lot of respect for my grandfather." I said, "I get that." I said, "But did you know that Robert E. Lee was also a commandant in the United States Army before the War of the States broke out?" He said, "No, I didn't know that." And I said, "Did you also know that he was faced with a proposition? He can go and serve in the United States Army during the Civil War, during the secession, and actually invade his home, his relatives, the business interests and everything. Or he can come join the Confederates and defend his home, his businesses, his interests in things of that nature. Did you know that he was presented with that option?" He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "Okay." I said, "Why do you think that he chose to defend the South versus fight for the North?" And he said, "I didn't know." And I was like, so let's paint this picture. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia, and I'm going to put myself in the position of Robert E. Lee. Not that I, condone slavery or the Civil War or anything like that, but it's an interesting point that we were talking about. And I said, look, I said, I'm a prior service Marine, right? I got out as a sergeant. I did 8 years, and they're asking me to go home and invade Charlottesville. What do you think I'm going to do? Am I going to follow orders and go invade the homes of my friends and my family and my loved ones? Or am I going to basically go defend them from this thing that's coming? And I said, I'm not taking a side either way. I'm just saying this was a choice that Robert E. Lee was faced with, right? So do you agree that that's hard for us to think about in today's time? I said, now let's take it back to the 19th century where you have these states, and they're not like the United States of America as we know them today. They were more like country states. Virginia was like a country over to his own self. South Carolina was a country to his own self. And they were working on becoming the United States. Okay. So when you think about history in its proper context, that was a difficult thing, right? These were men of their times. So they already thought that the Africans were somehow subhuman and therefore not competent and sufficiently not human, right? So he's at a point where he's befuddled, right? And I say, well, here's the thing. He fights the Civil War. He fights to basically preserve the legacy of slavery, but there's other nuances to Robert E. Lee, right? And I was like, so what do you think he did after the conclusion of the Civil War? He was like, I don't know. I was like, you do know that, he founded, he became the president of a little college in Lexington called Washington College. And he went throughout the South advocating for individuals who were a part of that cause to put away their weapons and symbolisms of war and rejoin the Union. So even Robert E. Lee said, don't fly the flags anymore. Don't put up any monuments. Don't do any of this. And this guy dropped and he didn't know what to think. And I was like, so by default, because you have these bumper stickers and things like that, and because you all worship Robert E. Lee, the thing that happened was he actually said that, put it away. And then we still see today that folks fly the flag and do all of that. And that's not what Robert E. Lee wanted. And he's like, man, you done taught me something that I've never known before. And I say, I didn't write it. I said, you can go back. This is history based upon like I said before, primary and secondary source information. And I was like, so if you're able to go back and you take a look at that, you'll then be able to inform your worldview, right? Not that I condone slavery, not that I condone any of that, but that's a prime example to go across the aisle and actually talk with the person that thinks differently than you, and then have an opportunity to have a conversation that informs, right? And that's not easy to have a conversation like that if you're not self-aware for yourself. Because a lot of times if we're holding on to inhibitions, if we're holding on to different things, and that makes sometimes folks can get triggered by those types of conversations. And so, you know, being able to have these types of experiences in my life has now gotten me to a point where I can say, you know, the goal of kind of researching and getting me to a point where I can, um, get into a position where I can actually learn a little bit about myself, learn about the world around me, and then also develop an appreciation for other cultures is the reason why we can take that and then allow ourselves to break those barriers down, break those walls down, to get us in a position to where we can actually start to have those tough conversations. And so that's my challenge to anybody that's on this call, right? Do the work. Look at your experiences, understand, the direction, understand the source of those experiences. Use them as an opportunity to grow yourself, to identify any sort of traumas, to be able to open up yourself emotionally and cognitively to basically be able to understand specifically from, the advantage of like, how would I do this from another culture's perspective? Or how would I address this topic if it comes to me directly? In addition to that, look at it from the worldview of what kind of trauma does that person have, right? What's their historical makeup or what kind of background do they have? and and as to the reasons as to why they're responding the way they are. And then that way we're able to get to a point where we can actually start to have like wholesome conversation and wholesome community, to allow us to bridge some of these things that we're up against now and in the future. So I know I've rambled a lot. You know, like I said, this is supposed to be a free-flowing conversation, but we do have about 14 minutes, and so I'll pause now to see if there's any questions. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Diane.
Yeah, George. Um, so are you still in contact with the young man that you talked to at the gas station? Is this
I
something
see him
that
every once in a while, and he's like, "Hey, George, what's up?" You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, and trust me, and anybody that knows me knows that I can make a friend with anybody within 5 minutes, right? That's just the way I move. It didn't always used to be like that, but you know, the goal is to try to figure out, okay, what do we have, what do we have in common, where are we similar, and then kind of build on where the similarities are. But yeah, I see him every once in a while, and yeah, I live in Hanover County, so Hanover County stays in the news, and so you almost have to be that way in order to, navigate these parts around here.
I do have one question about, you mentioned that you're referencing oral history that was documented from 1860?
Yes, ma'am. So we had
Where do you find a documented oral history other than the WPA, the slave narratives?
So you have oral histories that were documented within the family. So in this particular case, I told you all about my oldest great great uncle Garland Monroe, who was born in 1851. Well, that oral family history came from his wife, and so you also have that document being passed down from the generation through the generations. And some of us might even have family Bibles, right? That record the births, that record certain events. And so there is a term called the griot or the griot, however you want to pronounce it. That's an African custom, and it doesn't, you're not saying, hey, I'm going to grow up to be a griot. Like you actually get select, like it's like you're appointed, right? And so all of a sudden, it's like you start to get all of these family documents and pictures, and things like that, where, you're able to refer back to the past. In fact, if you give me 1 second, I'm going to show you something. I had a cousin that lived in Charlotte. I had never met him. He said, "Hey, I heard you were the family historian." Can you all see that?
Yeah.
So I get a call that says that he passed away from his wife, right? This is his great grandmother. Her name is Ludi. She is the daughter of my great great grandfather Ned. Now, if you look up any younger pictures of James Monroe, look at the features. Okay. So when I say, like, when you become the griot, it's like the histories, the documentation, the pictures, everything follows, right? And so you're able to take this information and then compile it, to basically be able to share with not only your family members but the world, like I'm sharing today. You know, she was a one of five sisters that moved from Albemarle County, Virginia, to New York City at the turn of the 20th century, and ended up going to Poughkeepsie and had a whole family. And there's this family member that makes it from New York down to North Carolina. Now he's looking me up because he heard that I was in the history and I represent the history for the family. He sent me all his stuff as part of his last wishes. So one question is, did your DNA test lead to any descendants of President Monroe? And so, yes, I got connected from a woman in Arizona. So any of you know anything about kind of how genealogy works, you can submit your ancestry.com results to something called GEDmatch, which is entered into a database to identify additional genetic matches. And so one of his, I think one of his daughters married into the Grosvenor family. And so this woman that I connected with was a descendant of the Grosvenor family. And so we ended up being blood cousins, and she's blonde haired and blue eyed. I have another example of that same relationship of a woman that lived in Markdale, Ontario, who was in Canada, where she reached out and she said, "Hey, I think we're cousins." Right? So we actually had a chance to meet in Richmond, Virginia. We had lunch and went to the State Library of Virginia and did some research. I was able to find the freedom papers for a family member that gained his freedom in 1803. Right? Just through research and being able to reach. And so it's kind of like the one thing that we want to call out is, how do you hate something that's a part of you? Like I just mentioned, I'm 27% European. So does that mean because I have an outward appearance of an African American male that I hate the other pieces that are part of me, regardless of how they got there? I would say no, right? So either I can embrace that and learn more about it, or I think we're worse off if we don't. So, any other questions?
Unfortunately, I do have another. You mentioned also Freedman cabin. Now, when you say
Yes, ma'am.
Freedman cabin, is that, because I know it's post emancipation, 1881 with your grandfather, but why is it called a Freedman cabin when it's after emancipation?
Well, because you have freedmen communities, right? So you were formerly enslaved down through the advancement of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now you're a freedmen, right? So you have freedmen communities and you have freedmen cabins. And so basically, that's what you have in terms of, if you go back and you take a look at the architecture of the time, the individuals would actually take, these tight pines, cut the trees down, and then they would do something called honing the wood. And that's basically where you're squaring the wood off. Okay. And if you come to Montpelier, you will see an example of that type of architecture that was taking place, where you're basically building a log cabin, okay? And you can see the axe marks. So down on the family farm, when you peel back the siding and things like that, you can see the axe marks of my great grandfather and the family members that helped him build that house. And we have pictures of it because, obviously those log cabins back then, they don't have the foundations and whatnot that we have in our houses today. They were actually built on rocks or some sort of like hard surface. Um, and so when there's time for repair, like we have to get in there with some hydraulic jacks, jack the house up, and then be able to, you know what I'm saying, repair the different logs that are under there. In fact, the last time we did it was about 10 years ago. And so you were able to see how the log cabins were actually built. And it's impressive that this cabin is still stands today. And my grandfather, like I said, had 18 children. And you look 5, 6 generations down, then we have judges in the family, we have lawyers, business owners, historians, right? Professionals, all out of that log cabin. So anyway, I digress, but that's the reason why they call them freedmen cabins.
Can
All
I
right.
jump in if there's not a question?
Absolutely, sir.
I love Diane's question in the context of this, of terminology. So I've been given tours at Montpelier for about 7 years. And terminology can get in the way. When I'm having a conversation with George, he's like, speak. Like, don't be so scared. Like, he's like, we're not messing up. Just get out there. And I usually like to say, Diane, the Gilmore Farm, because in 21st century terminology, I don't think cabin sounds right. This is a home they built for themselves, right? And they bought this land at an exorbitant price. But I think I also need to take George's advice and sometimes not be scared about saying the wrong thing, but having a person like Diane just ask, so what do you mean by that term? Having George ask Chuck, what do you mean by that? And engaging in these conversations, because I may come from a part of Virginia where light-skinned means something different from somebody in the next community, in the next high school. And when I talk to students,
Okay.
I ask them about light skin versus multiracial versus mixed, and the terminology can have different connotations, and we need to be careful that we're not attributing certain feelings or thoughts, or just have the person think about, like, what do I mean when I say light skin? Maybe I should think about what I mean by that terminology or something. So I love Diane's question about cabin. Sorry.
And may I also interject that I'm in the Chicago area and I grew up in Chicago and in the Chicago area. So when you cabin, I understand cabin, but when you associate freedom cabin, so I think that it's good that you mentioned what it's called for those of us who are researching and do not live in Virginia. I've only been there twice, actually, once to Montpelier and once to my mother's hometown. So yeah. Well, thank you, Patrick, for that.
All right. Any additional questions? I want to use the last minute to kind of give you all a rundown of some of the family photos. If there aren't any more questions. All right. So try to put this together. All right. So this is my picture of my grandfather Ned and his wife Harriet. Like I mentioned, Ned was born in 1828. He died in 1914. Harriet was born in 1848. She died in 1929. She was 19 years younger than him. Like I said, she was also his third wife. And then you have my great grandfather George, and this is Ned's youngest son. And my great grandmother Mary, who I had the privilege of actually knowing and being raised by. Grandpa George, I told this story about how he had a run-in with Theodore Roosevelt, and how Theodore Roosevelt, the president, wanted to borrow his hunting dogs, and basically Grandpa George told him no, and basically escorted him off the property. And so that story is well documented in a book called Scottsville on the James. This is my maternal grandfather, William Monroe, and this is my grandmother, Helois, right? And this is my mother and father, right? So as you can see, this is where I get my good looks from, you know. And then anybody that knows me knows that I love suits. I've always worn suits. This is a picture of me when I was 4 years old. Love suits, and I always will. This is a picture of me at the University of Virginia's Memorial to Enslaved Workers. You can see here that this is Ned's name listed. And then right below him is Harriet's name, his wife. And then this is my genetic makeup. I don't know if you all can see it, but look at all the different countries I come from, right? You got Norway, you got the northwest part of Europe, northwestern part of Europe, Germanic Europe, you got, the southern Bantu regions of Africa. And then over here, I don't know how that happened, but I'm somewhere in Filipino. So I thought that was pretty cool when I actually married a Filipino. And so this is one that's right here that I took this picture when I joined the NBC right on the site of Montpelier. And that is, we the people love. And so I think that's at the heart of what we need to be going after as we move forward. As we think about like what does the future hold for us as a nation. And so I always encourage those of you that have not been to Montpelier to come. Right, there's a lot of great work being performed by the MDC, the Montpelier Descendants Committee, as well as the Montpelier Foundation, where we're working together to tell whole truth history. Okay, and so this is the way we take out. The goal of this conversation was to give you my shared experience and how I'm looking at my view of the world, right, and how I'm looking to make inroads and bridge the gaps between differences, right? And so that way we can start to do this life together. Instead of being human doings, we become human beings again, really heavily focused on community. So I do want to thank you all for attending today. And I've put my email in the chat, and then I will also be putting a survey there with a follow-up message from me by email later on today with the recording to the session and everything. And I would love to hear from you. So if you have any follow-on questions after this, please let me know.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I think that's it. Yeah, like I said, please give me a shout if you need anything or if you have any questions in terms of research or where I can be of assistance in your journey. I'm more than happy and willing to help out where I can.